My uncle didn't even look at me when he said it. He was already leaning toward his attorney, this tall, polished man in a charcoal suit who charged $400 an hour and radiated the particular confidence of someone who had never once lost, and he was speaking quietly, the way people speak when they want you to hear them, but want plausible deniability that they meant for you to. She wore the uniform on purpose, Uncle Raymond said, for sympathy. It's textbook. His attorney smiled faintly and straightened a stack of papers. My Aunt Patricia nodded from the gallery without looking up from her phone. I sat across the courtroom alone, in my army dress coat, holding a leather journal against my knee. Then Judge Leonard Ashby opened the personnel file my attorney had submitted as a character exhibit. He read one page, then stopped, took his glasses off, looked directly at me, and said 3 words that rearranged the entire room. Fort Bragg, 2019. My uncle's attorney stopped smiling. Before the story gets darker, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what city you are watching from. Because betrayal does not always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the person who said they would wait for you. And sometimes they forget who they are dealing with. My name is Sergeant First Class Maya Okafor. I am 32 years old. I served 11 years in the United States Army 82nd Airborne Division, and for 8 of those years, I specialized in combat casualty care and field medical operations, the kind of work that puts you between a wounded soldier and the distance between him and home. I grew up in rural eastern Tennessee, outside a small town called Greenville, where the mountains stayed blue in the mornings and the summer smelled like clover and diesel and freshly cut hay. We were not wealthy. My grandmother, Dorothea Okafor, everyone called her Miss Dot, had raised 3 children mostly alone after my grandfather died young, and had built a modest but carefully preserved life from decades of disciplined saving. A small flower nursery she ran from the edge of her property, and a 4-bedroom house that sat on 2 acres of land worth considerably more than it looked. Miss Dot had raised me too, not officially at first, but effectively always. My mother, her youngest daughter, had struggled with addiction for most of my childhood. Not cruelly, not intentionally, she simply could not stay. And so from the age of 9, Miss Dot's kitchen table became my world. Her hands, rough from years in the garden, became the hands that braided my hair before school and pressed my uniform before graduation and held mine during every hard thing life put in front of me. She was the only person who never once made me feel like a burden. When I left for the army at 21, she stood on her porch in the early morning dark and pressed a small folded letter into my coat pocket. I didn't read it until I was on the transport bus. "You are always mine," it said. "Come home safe." I carried that letter through 2 deployments. Uncle Raymond was my grandmother's oldest son. 58 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who wore authority like a second skin even when nothing about the situation had granted it to him. He had moved back to Tennessee from Atlanta 3 years before Miss Dot's health began declining. At the time, it seemed like a good thing. Someone nearby. Someone to check on her. Someone to handle the small logistics of an aging woman living alone, grocery runs, medical appointments, the occasional repair the nursery property needed. Raymond positioned himself as devoted, attentive, the son who stayed. He called Miss Dot every evening. He sat with her at church. He introduced her proudly at community events, as though her presence reflected well on him. The first time I noticed something wrong, I was home on leave between deployments. I found an unfamiliar document on Miss Dot's kitchen counter, a financial power of attorney, partially filled out with Raymond's name printed carefully across the designated agent line. Miss Dot hadn't mentioned it. When I asked her about it, she looked confused. Raymond said it was just paperwork, she told me quietly. In case something happened, I photographed the document before I flew back to base. I told myself I'd look into it when I returned. I didn't return for another 14 months. The second warning came during a video call from Forward Operating Base in Romania. Miss Dot seemed distracted, tired in a way that didn't match her. She mentioned that Raymond had helped her reorganize some accounts and that there was a new financial advisor managing her investments. She couldn't remember the man's name. She thought Raymond had a business card for him somewhere. I wrote it down and moved on. Operational tempo overseas doesn't leave much space for civilian concerns, no matter how much those concerns matter to you personally. The third incident came from our neighbor, Mrs. Cecilia Pruitt, who had lived across from Miss Dodd's property for 40 years and still called me by my childhood nickname in every text she ever sent. She messaged me in December, 2 months before my rotation ended. "Baby, your uncle has somebody over at the nursery every week, taking measurements. Don't know what it means, but your grandma looks nervous and she won't talk about it." I called Miss Dodd that same night. She said everything was fine. Raymond was just exploring some investment opportunities related to the property. The nursery had been in our family for 31 years. The fourth thing I found myself. When I came home on transition leave and sat with Miss Dodd's bank statements, Raymond had been managing and filing on her behalf for 2 years under the power of attorney. I found a pattern so methodical it made my chest tighten. Small transfers, irregular amounts. An LLC registered to a company I didn't recognize. A property appraisal for the nursery land from 6 months prior that Miss Dodd had never seen. And a draft of a new will, unsigned, in which the nursery property, the house, and all associated land transferred entirely to Raymond upon Miss Dodd's death. The original will, which Miss Dodd had written 8 years earlier with her own attorney, left everything to me. I called a military legal assistance attorney that same afternoon. I did not tell Raymond I was home. The full picture came together on a Tuesday in February, 5 weeks before Miss Dodd passed. Her personal attorney, a quiet, careful woman named Helen Marsh, who had drafted the original will and maintained the estate documents for a decade, called me after Miss Dodd's hospitalization. Helen had been trying to reach Raymond for 3 weeks regarding updated estate documentation. He had not returned a single call. Helen had also discovered that Raymond had attempted to file an amendment to the power of attorney 6 months prior, extending his authority to include real property decisions. The amendment had been submitted to a notary in Atlanta, not in Greenville, not near anyone who knew Miss Dodd personally. The notary had stamped it, but Miss Dodd's signature, when compared to authenticated documents from the same period, showed tremor inconsistencies that a forensic document examiner confirmed were not present in her normal handwriting. Helen gave me the examiner's preliminary report over the phone. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 11 minutes after we hung up. Engine off, hands still on the wheel. Miss Dodd was upstairs in that building, and she had 2, maybe 3 weeks left. I walked back inside, sat beside her bed, and held her hand while she slept. I made my calls after midnight, when the hallway was quiet. Helen Marsh moved faster once she had the forensic report. She contacted the Tennessee State Bar's Estate Litigation Referral Network and connected me with an attorney named James Whitfield, who specialized in contested wills and elder financial exploitation. James reviewed Helen's documentation over a single weekend and told me Monday morning that we had a strong foundation. He filed a formal challenge to the power of attorney amendment within 72 hours, citing signature irregularities and procedural deficiencies in the notarization. Simultaneously, Helen secured the original authenticated will under court protection, ensuring that Raymond could not access or alter estate documents during proceedings. I also contacted the Army's Legal Assistance Office and requested character documentation, my service record, deployment history, commendation files, and a letter from my commanding officer attesting to my character. James wanted them as exhibits. Raymond did not know any of this was moving. He showed up at Miss Dodd's funeral in an expensive black coat, shook hands with the pastor, and told 3 different people he planned to honor Dodd's wishes regarding the property. He looked entirely comfortable. That was the last time Raymond looked comfortable for a very long while. The courtroom in Greenville was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, tall windows letting in flat winter light, the faint smell of old paper and floor wax. Raymond sat across the aisle with his attorney, a man named Gerald Foss from Nashville, who arrived with 2 assistants and a rolling case of files. My uncle looked confident in the practiced way of men accustomed to winning through resources rather than merit. When I walked in wearing my army dress coat, Raymond leaned toward Foss and said something quiet. Foss glanced at me and nodded slightly. My Aunt Patricia, seated in the gallery, rolled her eyes visibly. I sat beside James Whitfield. He placed Miss Dott's authenticated original will and the forensic document examiner's report in a neat row on our table. No theater, just evidence. Foss argued for nearly 20 minutes. Undue influence. Emotional manipulation. A soldier leveraging a sentimental elderly woman's admiration to position herself as sole beneficiary. He was skilled. I gave him that. Then Judge Leonard Ashby picked up the character documentation file James had submitted. He flipped 3 pages, then stopped entirely. He removed his glasses. Sergeant Okafor, he said quietly. Were you stationed at Fort Bragg in 2019? I looked up steadily. Yes, Your Honor. Something shifted in his expression. Professional composure over something deeply personal. My nephew was in your unit, he said carefully. Corporal Ashby, he told us about the ambush in March. The room went very still. I remembered Corporal Ashby clearly, 24 years old. Shrapnel wound to the left side, compound fracture. I had kept pressure on the bleed for 19 minutes, until the medevac landed in the dark. He came home, Judge Ashby said quietly. Because of decisions someone made under fire that night, Raymond said nothing. I simply nodded once. He fought hard, sir. Judge Ashby looked at the file for another long moment. Then he looked at Raymond. The remaining 40 minutes of that hearing felt like a formality. The ruling came down 11 days later. Judge Ashby found the power of attorney amendment invalid, procedurally defective, geographically irregular, and bearing signature characteristics inconsistent with authenticated samples from the same period. The amendment was struck from the record entirely. The forensic accountant James had retained confirmed transfers totaling $61,000 from Miss Dott's accounts to the LLC registered in Raymond's partner's name over 22 months. Those findings were referred to the district attorney's office for a separate criminal review. The original will, Miss Dott's own words, her own hand, filed with Helen Marsh a full 8 years before her death, was upheld in its entirety. The nursery, the house, the land, the accounts, all of it, exactly as Miss Dott had intended. Raymond did not speak after the gavel came down. He simply gathered his coat slowly, like a man who had aged a decade in a single hour. Gerald Foss packed his rolling case without making eye contact with anyone. Helen Marsh found me in the courthouse hallway afterward and squeezed my hand tightly without saying anything. Sometimes the right outcome doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like something that was always true finally being acknowledged out loud. The hardest part of coming home to the nursery was the quiet, not bad quiet, just Miss Dott's quiet. The particular absence of someone whose presence has shaped every room so completely that you felt their outline long after they were gone. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen windowsill, folded beside a half-finished crossword. Her gardening gloves hung on the nail by the back door, stiff with dry soil. The coffee maker was still set to 5:45 a.m., her wake-up time for 30 years, and I left it that way for weeks without meaning to. One morning in early April, I walked out to the nursery just before sunrise. The flower beds had gone slightly wild during everything, but the lavender rows were still standing. The air smelled like cold earth and something floral underneath. I found a hand-painted sign at the far row I hadn't noticed before. In Miss Dott's careful script, for Maya, everything blooms eventually. I stood there for a long time before I could walk back inside. I survived 11 years of military service. I made decisions in the dark under fire, with other people's lives in my hands and no margin for error. I did not expect the hardest thing I would ever face to happen in a Tennessee courtroom over a woman's flower nursery. But Miss Dot taught me something long before the army ever did. That love is proved in the staying. Not the grand gestures, not the court victories, just the staying. She stayed for me when no one else did. The least I could do was make sure the world knew exactly who she was and exactly who she trusted. That trust was never misplaced. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave your city in the comments. It means more than you know. I will see you in the next one.